Larisa Reisner stands frozen in time, captured in grain and silver nitrate, looking less like a Soviet commissar and more like a tragic heroine from a silent film. Her face is an arresting oval of pale determination framed by dark, unruly hair, and her eyes hold a strange, piercing intelligence that refuses to look away from the camera's lens. She is often pictured wrapped in a heavy black leather jacket that swallows her slender frame, a garment that became her armor and her signature, signaling to the world that she was no longer a creature of the drawing rooms, but a soldier of the new world. This photograph is our anchor, the only indisputable fact in a life that would soon be blurred by rumor, censorship, and the deliberate erasures of the state. To the modern eye, she seems like a glitch in the historical record, a figure of vivid, impossible color superimposed against a background of gray. We are taught that the early Bolsheviks were ascetic men in dusty coats, bureaucrats of the terror who viewed beauty with suspicion. Yet here is a woman who blazes with an undeniable cinematic glamour. How did she exist? In the archives of the early Soviet state, her presence feels like a fabrication, a legend inserted into the dry reports of grain requisitions and troop movements. She walks through the ruins of the Russian Empire not with the caution of a survivor, but with the confident stride of an owner. One has to ask, who allowed her to shine this brightly when the central tenet of the coming age was the crushing of the individual? Perhaps her visibility was not a privilege, but a calculated distraction, a beautiful mask worn by a regime that was already drowning in blood. To understand the immense danger she was in, one must understand the contradiction of her birth. She was not a daughter of the plow or the factory. She was a child of the aristocracy, born into a world of German philosophy, velvet curtains, and bound volumes of poetry. By all logic, she should have fled the revolution or perished beneath its heel. Instead, Larisa Reisner ran toward the fire. She traded the safety of exile for the horror of the Civil War, bringing with her a fierce intellectual arrogance that bewildered the rough peasant soldiers she commanded. There is a specific kind of madness in her transformation. She did not merely adopt the revolution, she seduced it. She treated the collapse of civilization as a grand stage for her own performance, writing breathless dispatches from the front lines while draped in the stolen furs of fleeing countesses. It was a duality that unsettled the true believers. Was she a committed communist? Or was she simply an adventurer addicted to the rush of history collapsing around her? Take the legendary campaign on the Volga River in 1918. This was the crucible where the Red Army was forged, a place of starvation, typhus, and summary executions. Amidst the filth of the gunboats and the stench of unwashed bodies, Larissa moved like a phantom. Accounts from the time describe her fearlessness with a mixture of awe and suspicion. When seasoned sailors cowered under artillery fire, she stood on the deck smoking a cigarette, watching the shells fall with a detached curiosity. She did not act like a nurse or a secretary. She acted like a goddess of war. This behavior won her the fanatic devotion of the fleet, but it also painted a target on her back. In a system that demanded absolute equality, to be exceptional was to be suspect. Every time she rallied the troops with her hypnotic oratory, she was proving that she possessed a power the party could not fully control, the power of pure charisma. We cannot tell her story without acknowledging the circle of wolves she walked among. Trotsky, Radek, the commanders, and the poets, they were all drawn to her flame. She was the woman they all wanted, yet she belonged to none of them. In the early days, this desire offered her protection. She was the muse of the Red Terror, the living embodiment of the beautiful, ruthless future they promised to build. But desire in the Kremlin is a fickle, dangerous currency. It turns easily into jealousy, and from jealousy into paranoia. While she laughed in the officers' mess, charming the architects of the new state, she was blind to the fact that she was witnessing their most vulnerable moments. She saw the fear behind their bravado. She knew who hesitated before signing the death warrants. She was collecting secrets simply by being in the room. And in the Soviet Union, a memory was the most dangerous thing a person could possess. There is a haunting quality to the accounts of her from these years, a sense that she was living on borrowed time. She moved too fast, spoke too loudly, and shone too aggressively. The Valkyrie of the Revolution, as they called her, was a symbol of the romantic phase of the uprising, the chaotic, blood-soaked honeymoon before the marriage settled into a loveless, bureaucratic tyranny. As long as the war raged, she was necessary. She was the poster child, the morale booster, the terrifying angel of vengeance. But wars eventually end. The guns on the Volga would fall silent, the leather jackets would be exchanged for gray suits, and the wild, unpredictable energy of the early days would become a liability. One wonders if she felt the walls closing in, even them. Did she sense that the very qualities that made her a legend, her beauty, her noble birth, her uncontrollable spirit, were drafting her death sentence? We are left with the image of a woman standing on the precipice of a new era, unaware that the ground beneath her feet is already crumbling. She believed she was one of the authors of history, holding the pen that wrote the future. She didn't realize that to the cold, calculating eyes watching from the shadows of Moscow, she was merely a character in a tragedy that had already been scripted. The leather jacket, the wind in her hair, the roar of the crowd, it was all a temporary illusion. Larisa Reisner was the face of a revolution that was about to devour its own children, and she, with her brilliant mind and blinding beauty, would be among the first to learn that the revolution has no heart, only an appetite. Larisa Reisner stands frozen in time, captured in grain and silver nitrate, looking less like a Soviet commissar and more like a tragic heroine from a silent film. Her face is an arresting oval of pale determination framed by dark, unruly hair, and her eyes hold a strange, piercing intelligence that refuses to look away from the camera's lens. She is often pictured wrapped in a heavy black leather jacket that swallows her slender frame, a garment that became her armor and her signature, signaling to the world that she was no longer a creature of the drawing rooms, but a soldier of the new world. This photograph is our anchor, the only indisputable fact in a life that would soon be blurred by rumor, censorship, and the deliberate erasures of the state. To the modern eye, she seems like a glitch in the historical record, a figure of vivid, impossible color superimposed against a background of gray. We are taught that the early Bolsheviks were ascetic men in dusty coats, bureaucrats of the terror who viewed beauty with suspicion. Yet here is a woman who blazes with an undeniable cinematic glamour. How did she exist? In the archives of the early Soviet state, her presence feels like a fabrication, a legend inserted into the dry reports of grain requisitions and troop movements. She walks through the ruins of the Russian Empire not with the caution of a survivor, but with the confident stride of an owner. One has to ask, who allowed her to shine this brightly when the central tenet of the coming age was the crushing of the individual? Perhaps her visibility was not a privilege, but a calculated distraction, a beautiful mask worn by a regime that was already drowning in blood. To understand the immense danger she was in, one must understand the contradiction of her birth. She was not a daughter of the plow or the factory. She was a child of the aristocracy, born into a world of German philosophy, velvet curtains, and bound volumes of poetry. By all logic, she should have fled the revolution or perished beneath its heel. Instead, Larisa Reisner ran toward the fire. She traded the safety of exile for the horror of the Civil War, bringing with her a fierce intellectual arrogance that bewildered the rough peasant soldiers she commanded. There is a specific kind of madness in her transformation. She did not merely adopt the revolution, she seduced it. She treated the collapse of civilization as a grand stage for her own performance, writing breathless dispatches from the front lines while draped in the stolen furs of fleeing countesses. It was a duality that unsettled the true believers. Was she a committed communist, or was she simply an adventurer addicted to the rush of history collapsing around her? Take the legendary campaign on the Volga River in 1918. This was the crucible where the Red Army was forged, a place of starvation, typhus, and summary executions. Amidst the filth of the gunboats and the stench of unwashed bodies, Larissa moved like a phantom. Accounts from the time describe her fearlessness with a mixture of awe and suspicion. When seasoned sailors cowered under artillery fire, she stood on the deck smoking a cigarette, watching the shells fall with a detached curiosity. She did not act like a nurse or a secretary. She acted like a goddess of war. This behavior won her the fanatic devotion of the fleet, but it also painted a target on her back. In a system that demanded absolute equality, to be exceptional was to be suspect. Every time she rallied the troops with her hypnotic oratory, she was proving that she possessed a power the party could not fully control, the power of pure charisma. We cannot tell her story without acknowledging the circle of wolves she walked among. Trotsky, Radek, the commanders, and the poets, they were all drawn to her flame. She was the woman they all wanted, yet she belonged to none of them. In the early days, this desire offered her protection. She was the muse of the Red Terror, the living embodiment of the beautiful, ruthless future they promised to build. But desire in the Kremlin is a fickle, dangerous currency. It turns easily into jealousy, and from jealousy into paranoia. While she laughed in the officers' mess, charming the architects of the new state, she was blind to the fact that she was witnessing their most vulnerable moments. She saw the fear behind their bravado. She knew who hesitated before signing the death warrants. She was collecting secrets simply by being in the room, and in the Soviet Union, a memory was the most dangerous thing a person could possess. There is a haunting quality to the accounts of her from these years, a sense that she was living on borrowed time. She moved too fast, spoke too loudly, and shone too aggressively. The Valkyrie of the Revolution, as they called her, was a symbol of the romantic phase of the uprising, the chaotic, blood-soaked honeymoon before the marriage settled into a loveless, bureaucratic tyranny. As long as the war raged, she was necessary. She was the poster child, the morale booster, the terrifying angel of vengeance. But wars eventually end. The guns on the Volga would fall silent, the leather jackets would be exchanged for gray suits, and the wild, unpredictable energy of the early days would become a liability. One wonders if she felt the walls closing in even then. Did she sense that the very qualities that made her a legend, her beauty, her noble birth, her uncontrollable spirit, were drafting her death sentence? We are left with the image of a woman standing on the precipice of a new era, unaware that the ground beneath her feet is already crumbling. She believed she was one of the authors of history, holding the pen that wrote the future. She didn't realize that to the cold, calculating eyes watching from the shadows of Moscow, she was merely a character in a tragedy that had already been scripted. The leather jacket, the wind in her hair, the roar of the crowd, it was all a temporary illusion. Larisa Reisner was the face of a revolution that was about to devour its own children, and she, with her brilliant mind and blinding beauty, would be among the first to learn that the revolution has no heart, only an appetite. The scent of French perfume and stale champagne fades, replaced instantly by the acrid, choking smell of coal smoke, cordite, and unwashed fear. The narrative shifts violently from the velvet salons of Petrograd to the iron decks of the Volga Flotilla, a floating purgatory where the fate of the revolution was being decided shell by shell. It was here, on the gray churning waters of Russia's greatest river, that Larisa Reisner reached the zenith of her terrifying power. She was no longer just a decorative ornament or a scandalous rumor. She was the Amazon, a political commissar with the authority to command fleets and the will to execute cowards. Standing on the bridge of a gunboat, wrapped in her signature leather jacket, she was the physical embodiment of the Red Army's ruthless, desperate energy, a figure so striking that even the battle-hardened sailors, men who had killed their own officers, lowered their eyes when she passed. At the center of this maelstrom stood another figure, the architect of the Red Army himself, Leon Trotsky. Their collision was inevitable, a meeting of two meteors blazing across the same dark sky. The connection between them on the Volga was electric, immediate, and fraught with immense danger. It was an intimacy forged in the crucible of near defeat, far deeper and more complex than a simple affair of the flesh. They were intellectual equals in a world of brutes, two high-minded fanatics who believed they could reshape humanity through sheer force of will. While historians debate the physical extent of their relationship, the emotional and political reality is undeniable. For those months on the river, they were a two-headed dragon. To be near Reisner was to be near the war commissar, and to whisper in her ear was to send a message directly to the brain of the military machine. This proximity gave her a terrifying influence. A word from her could save a regiment from the firing squad, or a dismissive glance could condemn a commander to a shallow grave on the riverbank. This is where the conspiracy tightens, where the threads of her eventual destruction begin to knot. By standing at Trotsky's right hand, Larissa became a witness to the foundational crimes of the regime, The brutal, dirty secrets that the future Soviet state would spend decades trying to erase. On that armored train and those repurposed steamers, decisions were made that had no basis in law or mercy. She saw the infamous decimation orders, where random soldiers were pulled from the ranks and shot to encourage discipline in the others. She sat in the telegraph room as instructions arrived to burn villages suspected of harboring whites, to sink barges filled with prisoners, to unleash a terror so absolute that it would break the spine of the opposition. She did not just watch, she participated. She signed papers, she vetted reports, she held the terrifying power of life and death in her manicured hands. She was not a passive observer of the Red Terror. She was its muse, its chronicler, and its accomplice. But witnesses are dangerous things, especially witnesses who are intelligent, independent, and prone to keeping diaries. What specifically did she see during those long, sleepless nights on the river? Did she read cables from Lenin that ordered atrocities too grotesque for the official archives? Did she see Trotsky in moments of weakness, doubt, or cold-blooded calculation that contradicted the hero myth he was building? The tension lies in the possibility that she knew too much. She saw the raw, bloody plumbing of the revolution before the marble facade was erected to hide it. She knew where the bodies were buried because she had watched the spades hit the earth. In the eyes of the emerging bureaucracy, the men like Stalin who were watching the Volga campaign with jealous, narrowed eyes from Moscow, her knowledge made her a ticking bomb. She was accumulating a mental archive of the regime's original sins, and in a state built on lies, the truth is the only lethal weapon. Her influence on the Volga was not just military, it was psychological. She brought a strange, feverish glamour to the slaughter. She organized libraries on the gunboats, demanding that illiterate sailors read the classics between battles. She wrote articles that turned the grim, muddy reality of the war into a heroic epic, painting herself and Trotsky as the divine avengers of the proletariat. But this very visibility was a trap. By tying her star so completely to Trotsky's, she was unknowingly signing her own political death warrant. She was creating a permanent association in the minds of the party elite. Reisner equals Trotsky. As long as he was the god of war, she was his untouchable high priestess. But gods in the Soviet pantheon had a habit of falling, and when they fell, they dragged their temples down with them. The shadow of her future doom was already stretching across the water, even as she stood triumphant on the deck, unaware that the man she idolized would one day be the most hunted man on earth, and her proximity to him would become the unpardonable sin of her life. The tragedy of the Volga chapter is that Larissa believed she was fighting for a utopia, while in reality, she was helping to construct the very prison that would eventually suffocate her. She thought she was proving her worth to the revolution, demonstrating that a woman could be as hard and as cruel as any man. She succeeded too well. She proved she was capable of wielding terrible power, and in doing so, she terrified the gray men who were waiting for the war to end. They saw a woman who could command a fleet, who could mesmerize a crowd, and who held the secrets of the war commissar in her heart. They saw a rival. They saw a liability. And as the white smoke of the gunboats drifted over the dark water, one gets the chilling sense that her file in the Cheka archives was growing thicker by the day, filled with the very deeds she thought were making her a hero. She was winning the war, but she was already losing the peace. The roar of the artillery fades, replaced by the hushed, suffocating intimacy of the Kremlin apartments and the smoke-filled suites of the Hotel Lux. Here, the war was not fought with shells and bayonets, but with whispers, dossiers, and the jagged edges of broken alliances. Larisa Reisner moved from the open deck of the gunboat to the claustrophobic inner sanctum of the Bolshevik elite, trading the clarity of the battlefield for the murky, treacherous waters of high politics. If the Volga was where she proved her courage, Moscow was where she exposed her fatal vulnerability. She became the Muse of Iron Men, a title that sounds romantic, but in reality described a position of extreme peril. In a city teeming with spies, where a casual remark could lead to an execution, Larissa did not just socialize with the architects of the new state, she slept with them, argued with them, and held their fragile egos in her hands. She was playing a game of musical chairs with the most dangerous men on earth, unaware that the music was being conducted by a relentless paranoia that would eventually demand silence. Her relationship with Karl Radek serves as the perfect, jarring lens through which to view this period. If Trotsky was the god of war, Radek was the devil of the intellect, a brilliant, cynical, disheveled propagandist who looked more like a scurrying monkey than a revolutionary hero. He was known for his biting wit, his endless cigarettes, and his ability to destroy a reputation with a single newspaper column. That the stunning Valkyrie would choose the unsightly Radek as a lover baffled the breathless gossip columns of the West, but it made perfect sense to those who understood Larissa's addiction. She was not in love with men. She was in love with the revolution itself. And Radek, with his razor-sharp mind and his finger on the pulse of the Comintern, was the revolution's nervous system. But this union was more than just an eccentric romance. It was a political alignment that sent shockwaves through the party. Radek was a man of shifting loyalties, a wild card who knew where all the bodies were buried. By entering his bed, Larissa was stepping into the center of a spider web, becoming privy to the cynical jokes and terrifying truths that these men only dared to speak when the doors were double locked. The conspiracy deepens when we consider the sheer scope of her access. She was not merely a passive companion, she was a conduit. She moved between the rival factions that were quietly sharpening their knives for the post-Lenin power struggle. She had the ear of the military through her past with the war commissar, the ear of the propagandists through Radek, and the admiration of the poets and writers who were trying to define the Soviet soul. In a system built on compartmentalization, where the left hand was not supposed to know who the right hand was shooting, Larisa Reisner was a dangerous anomaly. She was the common thread. She knew what the generals were saying about the politicians and what the politicians were plotting against the generals. One has to ask the chilling question, was she acting as a messenger, carrying secrets between these warring camps under the guise of romance? Or, far more dangerously, was she simply a loose cannon absorbing classified information that made her a liability to everyone involved? Imagine the scene in those dimly lit rooms, the air thick with tobacco smoke, the samovar hissing in the corner, and the man of the hour, be it Radek or another luminary, lying with his head in her lap, unburdening himself of the day's terrors. In these moments of exhausted vulnerability, the Iron Men ceased to be statues. They confessed their doubts about the path they were on. They whispered their fears of Stalin's rising shadow. They admitted to the monstrous compromises they had made to stay alive. Larissa heard it all. She became a living repository of the regime's weakness. To the secret police, the Cheka, who watched the comings and goings of the elite with reptilian patience, she was becoming a radioactive element. A woman who knows that the gods are afraid is a woman who cannot be allowed to survive indefinitely. She was gathering the kind of material that could topple careers, not because she intended to use it, but simply because it existed in her memory. There is a theory, whispered by those who study the shadows of this era, that her romantic entanglements were viewed by the Grey Cardinals not as moral failings, but as security breaches. In the eyes of the emerging police state, intimacy was a vector for treason. By linking herself to men like Radek, who were destined to fall out of favor, she was contaminating her own file. She was becoming guilty by association, entangled in the complex web of Trotskyism before the term even had a lethal definition. She walked through the corridors of power with a terrifying confidence, assuming that her personal connections made her untouchable. She failed to see that in a totalitarian system, personal connections are the first things to be severed. The men she loved were all playing a high-stakes game of survival, and when the time came to choose between the revolution and the woman, they would sacrifice the woman without a second thought. As she moved from one powerful orbit to another, she was unknowingly encircling herself with enemies. The wives of the party leaders, the jealous secretaries, the ambitious bureaucrats who had never been invited to her salons, they all watched with a simmering hatred. They saw her influence as illegitimate, a sorcery of the flesh and the tongue. And beneath the jealousy lay a colder political calculus. If you want to destroy a powerful man, you start by destroying the woman who knows his secrets. Larisa Reisner was becoming the soft underbelly of the opposition, the point of entry for the destruction that was to come. She was the muse, yes, but in the Greek tragedies she loved so much, the muse often sings the hero to his death. In the Soviet tragedy, the script was being rewritten so that the muse would die first, silenced not by a tragic fate, but by the quiet, efficient erasure of a state that had no more use for witnesses. She was collecting ghosts, and soon she would become one herself. The narrative now fractures, moving from the enclosed, smoky heat of Moscow to the damp, desperate cobblestones of Berlin in 1923. This is the espionage chapter, a shadowy interlude where Larisa Reisner trades her leather jacket for the disguise of a bourgeois lady and her open command for the terrifying silence of the underground. She was sent to Germany not as a diplomat, but as an accelerant. Her mission was grand, almost impossible: to ignite a German October, to spread the fire of the Bolshevik Revolution into the heart of Europe. But as she slipped across borders with false papers and suitcases heavy with Comintern gold, she was stepping out of the protective aura of the Kremlin and into a cold, indifferent void. In Moscow, she was a celebrity. In Berlin, she was just another shadow in a city teeming with spies, assassins, and desperate ghosts. The Valkyrie was about to learn that her invincibility was a local currency, valid only within the ring of Soviet bayonets. The atmosphere of this period is thick with the paranoid style of a noir thriller. Reisner operated in a world of safe houses, dead drops, and midnight meetings in the back rooms of grimy beer halls. She was tasked with moving weapons and money to the German communists, acting as the liaison between the Russian architects of chaos and the German foot soldiers. But almost immediately, the cracks began to appear. The German uprising was a disorganized, tragic farce, doomed before it began. Orders were contradictory, funds went missing, allies turned out to be informers. As the planned insurrection crumbled into street fights and confusion, a chilling realization began to dawn on her. Was this failure incompetence, or was it sabotage? The suspicion grows that the German October was never meant to succeed, that it was a sacrificial pawn move in a larger game being played back in Moscow. And if the revolution was a pawn, what was she? For the first time, Larissa felt the icy breath of expendability. Far from the adoring gaze of the Red Army, she was just an asset, a tool to be used until it broke. The theory arises here, dark and compelling, that her deployment to Germany was not a promotion, but an exile. Had she become too loud, too troublesome, too knowledgeable in Moscow? Was sending her into the jaws of the German police a convenient way for her rivals to be rid of her? If she succeeded, the glory would go to the party. If she was arrested or killed, she would become a martyr, safely silent and easily canonized. It was a win-win scenario for the men back home who were growing tired of her intense, demanding presence. She was walking through a minefield that had been laid not by the German authorities, but by her own comrades. Her letters from this period undergo a terrifying shift in tone. Gone is the arrogant confidence of the Volga campaign. In its place is a frantic, jagged poetry of fear. She writes of being watched, of the constant pressure in her chest, of the feeling that the walls are closing in. "I am walking on a razor's edge," she confessed to a friend, "and the wind is blowing me off." She describes the faces of the German workers, gaunt, defeated, looking at her not as a savior, but as a foreigner peddling a dangerous fantasy. The charm that had seduced admirals and commissars fell flat in the grim reality of a defeated Germany. Her beauty, once her weapon, became a liability, making her too visible in a world that demanded invisibility. She began to realize that the International was a cold, bureaucratic machine that viewed human lives as fuel, and she was burning up. The failure of the German Revolution was a brutal wake-up call. Larissa watched as the uprising was crushed, her comrades arrested or killed, while Moscow remained strangely silent. The support she expected never came. The extraction plans were vague. She was left stranded in the wreckage of a failed coup, forced to navigate her own escape through a continent that now hunted her kind. This experience broke something in her. It shattered the illusion that she was a protagonist in a romantic epic. She saw the cynical machinery of statecraft naked for the first time, the way the Comintern used true believers as kindling and then walked away from the ashes. She returned to Russia not as a conquering hero, but as a survivor of a shipwreck carrying a new, heavy knowledge. The party did not love her. The party did not love anyone. This chapter plants the seed of her ultimate disillusionment. She had seen the revolution export its chaos and fail. She had felt the sting of abandonment. As she crossed the border back into the Soviet Union, she was no longer the fearless Amazon. She was a woman who had seen the limits of her power. She had looked into the abyss of realpolitik, and the abyss had looked back with a bored, bureaucratic stare. The Berlin shadow had touched her, and though she was still alive, a part of her spirit had been left behind in the gray, hopeless streets of a city that refused to burn. She was returning to a home that was rapidly becoming a stranger to her, carrying the scent of failure on her clothes, a scent that the predators in Moscow would be quick to detect. The train rattled back into Moscow, but the city Larisa Reisner stepped into was not the one she had left. The air was colder, sharper, and devoid of the manic electricity that had fueled the early years. It was 1924, and a heavy, suffocating silence had descended upon the Kremlin. Lenin, the godhead of the revolution, was dying in Gorky, his mind disintegrating along with the old order. In his absence, a terrifying vacuum had opened, and filling it was not the fiery rhetoric of the battlefield, but the slow, grinding tectonic shift of bureaucracy. The romantic heroes, the poets, the cavalry commanders, the dreamers in leather jackets, were finding their access badges revoked and their phone lines dead. The age of the man of steel, Stalin, was quietly dawning, bringing with it a gray, monolithic conformity that had no place for a woman as vibrant and uncontrollable as Larissa. She had returned home only to find that the locks had been changed. The shift in atmosphere was subtle at first, a drop in temperature that one might mistake for a draft until it froze you to the bone. The open doors of the commissariats, once swung wide for the Valkyrie, were now guarded by unsmiling secretaries who claimed their bosses were in conference. The direct lines to the inner circle rang and rang, echoing in empty offices. The invitations to the private dachas, once automatic, simply stopped arriving. It wasn't a purge yet. It was a ghosting on a state level. Larissa, who had once walked into Trotsky's office without knocking, now found herself waiting in anterooms for hours only to be turned away by low-level functionaries who refused to meet her eyes. She was being erased from the present tense, relegated to the status of a historical artifact before she had even reached her 30th birthday. There is a specific, chilling scene that captures this new reality perfectly. Imagine Larissa entering the dining hall of the House of Government, her heels clicking on the parquet floor, her presence demanding the usual adoration. She wears a dress of dark red silk, a defiant splash of color in a room that is turned overwhelmingly drab. As she steps through the double doors, the hum of conversation, the gossip, the laughter, the clatter of silverware, abruptly cuts off. It is not a respectful silence. It is the silence of fear. Dozens of faces turn away. Men she had saved, lovers she had discarded, writers she had championed, they all suddenly find the contents of their soup bowls fascinating. In that deafening quiet, Larissa stands alone, a colorful bird trapped in a cage of gray wolves. She is no longer the mascot of the victory. She is a walking reminder of the chaotic, undisciplined past that the new order is desperate to sanitize. To be seen with her is no longer a badge of honor. It is a career risk. The man of steel did not need muses. He needed mechanics. Stalin's rise marked the ascendancy of the file-keeper over the orator. He viewed the flamboyant heroes of the Civil War with deep suspicion, seeing their charisma as a threat to the machine he was building. Larissa, with her aristocratic manners, her intellectual independence, and her intimate ties to the Trotskyite faction, represented everything he despised. She was a loose end, a chaotic variable in an equation that demanded absolute order. The glamour that had once shielded her was now acting as a beacon for the purge that was gathering on the horizon. The very qualities that made her a legend, her passion, her unpredictability, were now evidence of her unreliability. The revolution was growing up, putting away its childish things, and Larisa Reisner was being put away with them. A cold, bureaucratic dread began to seep into her daily life. It wasn't the visceral fear of the front lines, where death came with a scream and an explosion. This was a slow, creeping anxiety, the fear of the unopened letter, the knock on the door that never comes, the friend who crosses the street to avoid saying hello. She began to sense that she was being encircled by an invisible wall. Her articles were returned with heavy edits, stripped of their poetic flair and filled with dull, approved jargon. Her requests for travel were lost in the labyrinth of the paperwork. She was being suffocated by the system she had helped to create. The realization must have been devastating. The revolution she loved was not dead, but it had mutated into something that had no love for her. She was a relic of a bygone era, a beautiful, dangerous antique that was slowly being pushed to the back of the shelf where the dust could settle and the memory could fade. In this new Moscow, the shadows were longer and the nights were quieter. Larissa wandered through the city like a ghost in her own life, haunting the places where she had once reigned supreme. She tried to keep up appearances, to laugh too loudly and drink too much, to pretend that the silence in the room was just her imagination. But the dread was real. The eyes watching her were no longer filled with desire, they were filled with calculation. They were measuring her for a coffin, not of wood, but of oblivion. The turning of the tide was complete. The water was rising, cold and gray, and Larisa Reisner, the woman every leader had once desired, was finding that in the new Soviet Union, there was no high ground left to stand on. Denied the sword, Larisa Reisner reached for the pen, unaware that in the Soviet Union, ink could be more lethal than lead. As the doors of power slammed shut and the phone lines went dead, she retreated into the only territory she still controlled, her writing. But this was not the propaganda of the early days, the breathless odes to the Red Army that had made her famous. This was something darker, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. She began to pour her disillusionment into vivid, undeniable prose, crafting sketches and articles that stripped the varnish off the revolutionary dream. To the casual reader, they were travelogues from the Urals or reports from the coal mines of the Donbass. But to the censors and to the paranoid men in the Kremlin, they were indictments. She was committing the cardinal sin of a totalitarian regime. She was describing reality accurately. We must look closely at these final texts, reading between the lines as her enemies surely did.
In her descriptions of the exhausted workers, there is no heroic glow, only grime, sweat, and a bone-deep fatigue that betrayed the promise of the workers' paradise. She wrote of the new managers, bloated, corrupt bureaucrats who had replaced the factory owners, wearing different clothes but wielding the same whip. She described the poverty of the provinces with a cinematic clarity that made the official statistics look like lies. There were coded messages in her metaphors, references to stagnant waters, rusted machinery, and blind captains. She was writing about a revolution that had lost its way, a ship drifting without a compass. This was her fatal mistake. She believed that her loyalty to the ideals of October gave her the right to criticize the reality of the Soviet state. She did not understand that the state had become the only ideal that mattered, and any criticism was treason. Her fiction was cutting too close to the bone. She was documenting the great betrayal in real time. When she wrote about the gray dust settling over the vibrant towns of the revolution, she was writing about Stalin. When she described the silence of the old heroes, she was writing about the fear that was strangling the party. She wasn't just telling stories. She was building a case. She was becoming a witness for the prosecution in the court of history, preserving the truth of what was being lost. The rising leadership, obsessed with controlling the narrative, could not tolerate an independent voice, especially one as talented and widely read as hers. Her prose was too sharp, her eye too keen. She was shining a flashlight into the dark corners where the new elite were burying their mistakes, and they blinked in the glare, angry and exposed. It is a chilling thought that her literary talent became the final nail in her coffin. If she had been a mediocre writer, churning out dull praise for the 5-year plan, she might have survived. She might have lived to be an old woman, safe in her obscurity. But Larisa Reisner could not write dullness. Her sentences burned, her imagery stuck in the mind like a splinter. She made the corruption visible, the fatigue palpable, the fading hope undeniable. Every article she published was a challenge to the official lie. She was shouting, "The emperor has no clothes," in a crowded square where everyone else was applauding the imaginary robes. And in a dictatorship, the person who points out the nakedness is not thanked. They are silenced. The tragedy deepens when we realize she likely thought her past status protected her. She believed her name, her history on the front lines, and her connections to the old Bolsheviks gave her immunity. She was wrong. Those connections were now liabilities, and her truth-telling was seen as arrogance. The censors began to circle. Manuscripts were delayed. Editors became nervous. The invisible net was tightening around her typewriter. She was writing her own obituary, word by beautiful, dangerous word. She was documenting the death of the soul of the revolution, unaware that by doing so, she was ensuring that her own body would soon follow. She had become an inconvenience, a mirror that reflected the ugly transformation of the state, and the state was preparing to smash the mirror. The stage empties, the lights dim, and Larisa Reisner is left standing alone in the center of the spotlight, a target
painted on her back. This is the emotional core of the thriller, the moment when the machinery of betrayal shifts from the political to the deeply personal. It wasn't a sudden dramatic purge that isolated her. It was a slow, agonizing retreat of the men who had once sworn their eternal devotion. One by one, her protectors vanished into the fog of their own survival. Trotsky, the lion of the revolution, was no longer a kingmaker. He was a hunted animal, fighting a losing battle for his political life against the relentless grinding of the Stalinist machine. He could barely save himself, let alone the woman who had once been his shadow. Radek, the brilliant cynic, was busy making compromising deals, selling pieces of his soul to buy a few more years of existence. He knew that associating with Larissa, the living symbol of the Trotskyite glamour, was a luxury he could no longer afford. The heartbreak here is not romantic. It is tactical. Larissa wasn't just dumped. She was uninstalled. She became radioactive. In the binary world of Soviet loyalty, you were either with the rising sun or you were in the dark, and Larissa was undeniably, fatally associated with the setting suns of the past. To be seen with her was to admit an affiliation with the losing side, a confession that could end a career or a life. The men who had once fought for a seat next to her at the opera now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Invitations to the Kremlin banquets dried up. The phone in her apartment, once the nerve center of the Moscow elite, sat silent for days on end, a black plastic tombstone in her living room. The silence was not just lonely, it was terrifying. In a system where your existence depends on your connections, silence is the first symptom of death. Desperate to counter this erasure, Larissa threw herself into a frantic, almost manic social calendar. She went to every gallery opening, every literary reading, every reception where the doors weren't yet barred to her. She dressed in her finest silks, wore her brightest lipstick, and laughed with a shrill, brittle energy that fooled no one. This wasn't vanity. It was survival. She understood the grim physics of the terror. Visibility is the only shield against disappearance. If you are seen, if you are talked about, if you are present, it is harder for them to simply snatch you off the street. She was dancing on the edge of a precipice, trying to dazzle the wolves so they wouldn't bite. She turned every dinner party into a performance, forcing the room to acknowledge her, to validate her continued existence. "I am still here," her laughter seemed to scream. "I am still Larisa Reisner, and you cannot forget me." But the room was shrinking. The air was getting thin. We can imagine her returning home from these exhausting performances, the mask slipping from her face the moment the door clicked shut. She would sit in front of her mirror, wiping away the makeup, staring into eyes that were wide with a growing panic. She knew the game was rigged. She knew that her friends were actually informers, that her lovers were cowards, and that her time was running out. She was like a star that burns brightest right before it collapses. The abandonment was total. She was a muse without a poet, a queen without a court, a revolutionary without a revolution. She was exposed to the elements, and the storm was coming. The tragedy is that she was too proud to beg, too brave to flee, and too deeply in love with Russia to leave. She stood her ground as the ground crumbled away, a solitary figure waiting for the inevitable fall. The year is 1926. Larisa Reisner is 29 years old, a woman in the prime of her life, a veteran who has survived the typhus-ridden trenches of the Civil War, the starvation of the Volga campaign, and the chaotic violence of the German underground. She is a survivor, forged in fire and ice. And then, suddenly, she is dying. The official story, the one printed in the somber columns of Pravda, speaks of typhoid fever, perhaps a lingering malaria from her travels in Persia or the Donbass. It is a plausible, tragic explanation. Illness was rampant, hygiene was poor, and even the elite were not immune to the microbes of the time. But in the shadow history of the Soviet Union, plausibility is often the mask worn by murder. The timing is too precise, the descent too rapid, the victim too convenient. The narrative zooms in on a specific evening, a moment that acts as the fulcrum of the tragedy. Larissa attends a reception, a modest gathering perhaps, with the few acquaintances who still dare to be seen with her. There is laughter, forced and brittle. There is food, simple but shared. And there is a drink. Maybe it is a glass of milk, offered by a solicitous waiter with eyes that are a little too cold. Maybe it is a toast of wine shared with a smiling rival who has recently been promoted by the Stalinist faction. She drinks, she smiles, she goes home. Within hours, the fire is in her blood. The onset is not the slow, creeping malaise of natural infection. It is a violent, thunderous assault on her system. She collapses, her body racking with fever, her mind plunging into delirium. It is as if a switch has been flipped, turning off the light of her vitality in a single brutal motion. As she burns in her bed, the whispers begin to circulate through the darkened apartments of Moscow. These are dangerous whispers, spoken only behind running faucets to mask the sound. They speak of Laboratory Number 1, the secret toxicology unit of the OGPU, later the NKVD. They speak of active measures designed to remove problematic figures without the mess of a public trial or a firing squad. In 1926, the Great Terror has not yet fully unleashed its bloody wave of arrests, but the tools of the trade are already being sharpened. A biological assassination is clean. It leaves no bullet holes, no signed execution orders, only a grieving family and a medical certificate stating natural causes. It is the perfect weapon for a regime that still cares about international opinion, a way to silence a loud voice without making a noise. Was Larisa Reisner the test subject for this new silent warfare? She was the perfect candidate. She was too famous to arrest without scandal, too well connected abroad to simply disappear, yet too dangerous to be allowed to continue writing and speaking. A tragic illness solved the problem of Larisa Reisner with elegant finality. It turned a political threat into a sentimental tragedy. It allowed her enemies to mourn her instead of prosecuting her. As the fever consumes her, eating away at the strength that once commanded battleships, one has to wonder if she knew. In her moments of lucidity, did she look at the glass of water on her nightstand with suspicion? Did she realize that the enemy was not a bacteria, but a decision made in a quiet office in the Kremlin? The symptoms are relentless. Her mother, keeping vigil by her bedside, watches helplessly as the vibrant, beautiful woman disintegrates before her eyes. The doctors are summoned, but their behavior is strange. Are they there to cure her or to monitor the progress of the poison? Their diagnoses shift. Their treatments are ineffective. The phantom fever burns through her defenses with a terrifying efficiency. This is the climax of the mystery, the moment where the historical record blurs into the realm of the conspiracy thriller. We will never see the file that ordered her death. If it ever existed, it was burned long ago.
But the question hangs in the stale air of the sick room, heavy and suffocating. Does a woman who survived the apocalypse of the Civil War simply fade away from a fever? Or was she extinguished because her light was blinding the men who preferred to work in the dark? The hospital room in the Kremlin is sterile, white, and terrifyingly quiet. The roar of the revolution, the applause of the crowds, the thunder of the Volga guns, all of it has been reduced to the ragged, shallow breathing of a dying woman. Larisa Reisner, the icon who once commanded the attention of the entire Bolshevik elite, is now alone. The isolation of her final days is not an accident. It is a quarantine. The silence that surrounds her bed is deafening, a physical weight that presses down on the chest. Where are they? Where are the poets who wrote verses about her eyes? Where are the commanders who named their gunboats the Larisa Reisner? Where are the iron men who claimed to love her more than life itself? They are gone. Their absence is a sprawling, silent indictment. Radek does not come. He is too busy surviving. Trotsky does not come. He is already a pariah, and his presence would only accelerate her doom. The brave sailors of the Baltic fleet, the writers of the prolet cult, the diplomats, they have all vanished into the woodwork. Their empty chairs by her bedside are not just a sign of personal betrayal. They are a confirmation of collective cowardice. To visit Larisa Reisner now is to mark oneself. It is to step into the spotlight of the secret police. So they stay away, offering their excuses to their mirrors, leaving her to face the darkness with no hand to hold but one. That hand belongs to her mother. In this cold, terrifying machine of a hospital, her mother is the only anchor to humanity left. She sits by the bed, a small, grieving figure witnessing the agonizing disintegration of her brilliant daughter. She is the only one who sees the sweat, the delirium, the fear in Larissa's eyes. But she is helpless. She is a relic of the old world, powerless against the new reality. She watches the doctors with a growing, gnawing suspicion. These men in white coats do not move with the urgency of healers. They move with the detached precision of guards. They check charts, they whisper in corners, they administer injections that seem to do nothing but deepen the coma. Are they saving her? Or are they merely overseeing the expiration of a problematic file? The mother's gaze is the audience's gaze, filled with horror and the dawning realization that there is no help coming. The claustrophobia is suffocating. Larissa is dying in the very heart of the machine she helped to build. The Kremlin, once the fortress of her dreams, has become her mausoleum. The thick walls that were supposed to protect the revolution are now keeping the world out and the secrets in. Every sound, the click of a latch, the squeak of a trolley, the distant chime of the Kremlin clock,
amplifies the sense of entrapment. She is a prisoner of her own victory. The state she championed has metastasized around her, growing over her like a cancer, and now it is digesting her. There is a terrible irony in her location. She is just yards away from the centers of power where her fate was likely decided, dying within shouting distance of the men who signed her death warrant with their silence. As the end draws near, the room feels less like a hospital and more like an airlock. The oxygen is being slowly sucked out. The Valkyrie is not fighting anymore. She is drowning in the gray indifference of the system. The empty bedside is the final brutal message from the party to its most beautiful daughter. You were never one of us. You were only useful. And as her heart struggles to beat one last time, the only sound in the room is the weeping of a mother who knows that her daughter is not just dying, but being erased.
The hero is alone. The stage is bare. The revolution has left the building. The breathing stops. The silence in the Kremlin hospital room becomes absolute. Larisa Reisner is dead at 29. But the moment the heart ceases to beat, the machine springs back to life. The state, having ensured her silence, now rushes to claim her corpse. The isolation of her final days is instantly replaced by a flurry of performative grief that is as loud as it is hollow. The very men who were too terrified to hold her hand while she was dying now elbow each other out of the way to stand by her coffin. It is a grotesque theater of mourning, a play scripted by the Central Committee where the actors are also the executioners. The funeral is a grand, somber affair staged with the heavy brutalist aesthetic of the early Soviet state. Flags are lowered, brass bands play dirges in the freezing air, and the black crepe of mourning is draped over the city that had turned its back on her. We see the faces of the elite, the Iron Men, the gray bureaucrats, the survivors, looking solemn and composed. They deliver eulogies that are masterpieces of hypocrisy, praising her fiery spirit, her unyielding dedication, and her beauty that served the revolution. They turn her into a statue before she is even in the ground, freezing her into a safe marble symbol that can no longer speak, criticize, or remember. This is the final insult. They are not just burying a woman. They are burying the truth. They are shoveling earth over the complexity, the disillusionment, and the dangerous secrets she held, smoothing over the grave until it looks perfect and undisturbed. But while the public is distracted by the funeral cortege, a darker operation is taking place in the shadows. Within hours of her death, perhaps even before the body was cold, men in leather coats arrive at her apartment. They do not knock. They have the keys. These are not thieves. They are the archivists of the secret police, the cleaners of history. They move through her rooms with practiced efficiency, ignoring the jewelry and the furs that once scandalized Petrograd. They are hunting for something far more valuable: paper. They sweep the desks, empty the drawers, and pull books from the shelves to shake them for hidden notes. The narrative focuses on the specific tragedy of this paper purge. Her diaries, filled with the intimate, unfiltered thoughts of a brilliant mind witnessing the birth of tyranny, are tossed into sacks. Her unsubmitted manuscripts, the stories that might have exposed the rot at the heart of the system, are seized. The letters from Trotsky, from Radek, from the poets and the generals,
They all disappear into the maw of the Lubyanka. This is the erasure. It is the systematic deletion of Larisa Reisner, the person, leaving behind only Larisa Reisner, the myth. They are sanitizing her legacy, scrubbing away the fingerprints of the men who betrayed her and the evidence of the crimes she witnessed. As the men in leather coats leave, carrying the heavy sacks down the stairs, the apartment is left strangely empty, stripped not of furniture, but of soul. The physical erasure mirrors the historical one. Larissa is being edited out of the story she helped write. The Valkyrie is dead, and the state is making sure that her ghost will never be able to testify. The funeral ends, the crowd disperses, and the grave is sealed. But in the archives of the secret police, a new file is tied shut with string and placed in a deep, dark vault, a file that contains the real Larissa, imprisoned in paper, waiting for a liberation that might never come. The earth settles over the grave, the speeches fade into the wind, and a terrible silence descends, not just over Larisa Reisner, but over the entire generation she represented. The finale of our story steps back from the immediacy of her death to survey the long, bloody shadow it cast. She was not merely a casualty of illness. She was the first domino in a chain reaction of catastrophe. Within a decade, the Great Terror would erupt, turning the Soviet Union into a slaughterhouse where the heroes of the Civil War were fed into the grinder by the thousands. Almost every man who had loved her, every man who had stood by her coffin and lied, would eventually meet the executioner. Radek would perish in a labor camp. The generals would be shot in basements. Trotsky would meet an ice axe in Mexico. Larissa, in a grim twist of fate, was spared the show trials and the gulags. She died while the dream was still gasping for air before it fully suffocated under the weight of the nightmare. But her death served as a warning, a canary in the coal mine moment that went unheeded until it was too late. She was the proof that the new system had no room for brilliance, for individuality, or for the kind of wild romantic passion that had sparked the revolution in the first place. The man of steel required cogs, not stars. By erasing her, the state was signaling the end of the age of idealism and the beginning of the age of the machine. Her memory became a ghost that haunted the survivors. In the freezing barracks of the Gulag, old Bolsheviks would whisper her name like a prayer to a lost goddess, remembering the woman in the leather jacket who once made them believe that they were building heaven on earth before they realized they were digging their own graves. Today, Larisa Reisner is a phantom. Her books are out of print, her name largely forgotten, her face known only to those who dig through the dusty archives of the 20s. She was successfully sanitized, turned into a harmless footnote in the official history. But the mystery remains, vibrant and disturbing. Was she killed for what she did, or for who she was? The answer, perhaps, is that she was a living mirror. She reflected the soul of the revolution, its beauty, its cruelty, its soaring hope, and its inevitable corruption. The new tyrants couldn't bear to look at her because in her eyes they saw the reflection of their own betrayal. They broke the mirror, but they could not destroy the image. She remains the beautiful ghost of the Soviet utopia, forever young, forever dangerous, and forever asking the question that no one in power dares to answer. What have you done with our dream? The archives are deep, and many files remain sealed. If you want to uncover more forbidden stories from the Red Century, the videos on your screen now will take you further into the shadows. What do you think? Was Larisa Reisner a victim of a tragic illness, or was she the first target of a silent purge? Leave your verdict in the comments below. And if this story held you in its grip, leave a like to help keep the memory of the Valkyrie alive.